everybody. My name's Adam Godet. I'm a woodworker here in Washington, D.C. My shop is in the Capitol Hill neighborhood. I have a one-car garage converted into a wood shop, which I am quickly outgrowing, but be that as it may, making do with a small space. So we've been doing a series of workshops here all summer, covering everything from basics of wood science, so wood is a medium and what to know before you get started with it. We talked about sharpening tools, and we've gone through various types of joinery that you can cut by hand with very basic tools. And this morning, we are wrapping up this workshop series with the fanciest of all of these joints, the dovetail joint. Dovetail joint looks a little bit something like this. This is kind of a rough one here that I use in the shop. If you want to see fancier versions, you're welcome to check out my website, which is godetfurniture.com. On Instagram, I am Godet_woodworking, and I post pictures on there all the time of fancier joints. So basically, I'm going to cover how to make this joint, and I'll talk about all the various different steps and walk you through it. This is really more of a demonstration, just so you can see the different steps involved in doing it, how actually if you follow these steps, it's very, very accessible despite being the fanciest of the joints that we're covering this summer. And yeah, I think we have all the tools in the Maker Hub to be able to do this, and I'll be happy to show any of you in person once we get back in there. So before I get started, does anybody have any questions on anything about the joint or anything? Everybody can hear me okay? We're good to go?
You sound great.
Thanks. All right, so the dovetail's been around like a lot of woodworking joints for millennia. The ancient Egyptians used this in their tools and in their building, and it's been very common ever since. Like I said at the outset, it's often seen as like a fancy or showy joint, and it is. Craftsmen like to demonstrate just how perfectly they can cut these dovetails, especially with a handsaw and a chisel, which is what we'll use today. But it's also important to know that it's a very utilitarian joint. So this joint, as you can see, it basically is a wedge. So one of the, basic simple machines of physics, and you cannot pull these joints apart in this way. It's a very, very strong mechanical joint, and it takes advantage of the strength properties of the wood itself, these long grain joints, which we talked about in the first session. So you're welcome to go back and look at that if you'd like to know more. It can be a little bit challenging to cut, but I'm going to walk you through all of that. And I'll also point out that, again, while the Egyptians used it as a very sort of utilitarian joint, we used it here too as a utilitarian joint back in times of hardship in the Depression and World War II, where we had limitations on materials. This is a very accessible thing, because if you're building crates or you're shipping something and there happens to be a shortage of nails or something like that, you can make this joint very, very quickly and crudely, as I've done with this one, in addition to being able to make them fancy for things like cabinets and boxes and that kind of thing, which is another point I'd like to make, actually. This joint, while being showy, is also just a very, very good way to join two boards at a 90-degree angle. We use it all the time in cabinet making and fancier cabinets. You'll see it in drawers. It's probably the most common place you'll see it in your furniture. And you'll see it anywhere where a craftsman wants to show off, like on a jewelry box or something like that. I've put them on desktops. I've used them in wine displays, wine racks, and that kind of thing. So a note on the tools I'm going to use this morning. I am a professional craftsperson, and I have professional quality tools. That's an investment I've been making for decades. We have some of these same tools in the Maker Hub. If you're trying to do this at home, you can use almost anything. I'm going to use a very nice handsaw that was probably a couple $100, but you could do this using, a $7 blade for a hacksaw from the hardware store. I've done it. The important thing is that we focus on layout. And as I've mentioned in some of the other sessions on joinery cutting, a lot of woodworking is actually just waste removal. Once you've laid out what you need to remove, it's just carefully removing that waste and then putting the parts together in a satisfactory way. All right, so with that all out of the way, I'm going to talk about the joint itself and then get into the demonstration. So as you can see here, we have two pieces of wood joined up, and it's made up of two separate parts. We have this board, which is commonly referred to as the tail board. So you can see that these dovetails resemble, you know, little bird tails, like the very end. It has that sort of flaring shape. And we call this side of the joint the pin board. And that's because these little pieces here sort of resemble little pins. And once we've laid out and cut these two pieces, they simply lay together and fit together just like puzzle pieces.
Actually, Adam,
Yes.
could you angle the camera down just a little bit? I think we'd like to see what you're doing. Well,
Thanks for the heads up.
and up just a tiny bit so we can see all of your head, just like a fraction of an inch.
There we go.
Perfect. Excellent. Thank you.
So as you can see, I just sort of knocked those pieces together. Cutting dovetail joints feels a lot like making your own puzzle and then putting the pieces together. So again, I just laid those two pieces on top of each other and knocked them together. This joint also gets glued. So it is a very strong mechanical joint, and it's very, very strong in this one direction. Obviously, it can be knocked apart with a good hammer in this direction, and that's where the glue comes in and really reinforces the joint, making it, you know, essentially bomb-proof, as it were. So again, we have the tail board and the pin board. If you want to spend a lot of time wasted, you can go online and search tails first or pins first, and you will find any number of woodworkers out there advocating for cutting one side of this joint before the other. It really doesn't matter. You just pick one that works for you and stick with it and practice that way. For me, cutting the tails first makes the most sense. That's the way I've learned how to do it, the way I've had the most success. So that's what I'm going to show you today. So to get started, we're joining these two pieces of wood, and we want them to be flush where they meet. And in order to do that, we need to set basically a baseline so that we cut those dovetails and the pins exactly the same depth so that when they join up together, those two pieces come flush. Now you can do this in any number of ways. The easiest and most efficient way is to use this marking gauge here that I have, and we have one of these in the Maker Hub, I believe. And basically this just allows you to figure out the thickness of the wood and then transfer it, you know, 90 degrees. And so that's all I'm going to do here. This is the first step. It's called setting the baseline. So I've got the thickness of the piece of wood. On the pin board, I'm just going to mark the faces. And on the tail board, I'm going to mark all four sides. And that'll become evident later on. So on the pin board, I'm going to go ahead and mark these two faces. Tail board is going to get all four sides. All right. Again, layout is extraordinarily important with this joint. So I'm just going to highlight this with a pencil here. And this will help you to see what I've done, but it also helps me when I go to cut the joint, just make it more evident. A lot of higher end woodworking is knowing how to hide and fix small mistakes. It's also about avoiding them to begin with. So that's how we do that to start with. So now that I have the baseline marked, and I'm going to start on this tail board, the next thing we need to do is determine how wide we're going to make the dovetails. Now you can really do this any way you like. Some people just eyeball it. Some people do intentionally different sizes. I like mine to be all uniform. So I'm going to use this ancient tool, which is called a divider. And basically all it is two sharp points that come together and then a micro adjusting threaded wheel here. And that allows you to set and change very minutely the distance between these 2 points. And what I'm going to do is put this board in the vise and then walk this out until I have exactly the size dovetails I want. And then I'll mark out where they go. So I'm going to go ahead and adjust the camera here a little bit and put this guy in the vise. So by putting this set of dividers across the top of the board here, I can mark out 1/2 of the dovetails. And basically I want like just, you know, about 1/8 of an inch on either side of the board that's going to end up getting cut away when we go to make the joint. So I can walk this across, I can change the setting here and there, and small adjustments will make a big difference because you're doubling. In this case, I'm going to cut 2 dovetails. If I was cutting 3, it would triple. So these small changes are important to not overdo. So I walk this out and I see that it looks just about where I want it. So I'm going to go ahead and mark a hole here and mark one here. And then I'm going to do the opposite side. And then you'll see I have 4 little pinholes. Are those visible to you all? 4 pinholes on there. And those are the guide marks for how we're going to cut these joints. So the next thing I'm going to do is use a dovetail marking tool. Now you can, again, use a bevel gauge. You could eyeball it. You could use a ruler. This just makes it very easy to do in a single step. So I'm going to lay this on with the angled side on the face of the board and the 90-degree mark across the top. And then using a sharp pencil, I'm just going to mark across the top here and down the side and follow my little divider marks. Oops. Good place to make a mistake, right on live camera. So got a little over eager there. There we go. And mark it out. And because I'm going to have to watch from this side as I show you, I will mark out on this side too. But normally, you really only need to do one side. Now, hopefully it's becoming apparent and you can see those lines. I'm going to remove here, here, and here. And this board will start to resemble this board with just those tails remaining. So now comes the fun part. I'm going to just cut these freehand with a handsaw. You can do this on a table saw. You can do it on a bandsaw. This is far and away, I think, the easiest way is to just use a handsaw to get good handsaw skills. I've talked in other videos about handsaw skills, but just the very basics. You want to use a back saw. So that's a saw that has this sort of spine across the top of it. We have one in the maker hub. And you want to make sure that you're holding it lightly. So your index finger comes out along the end here, which is sort of a signal to the brain to keep that in a straight line. And you want to hold the saw lightly. It's about the same amount of pressure that you would use if you were holding an egg in your hand. It's enough to make sure you don't drop it, but you don't want to squeeze the thing. What happens when you squeeze it is you squeeze it so hard, you get these white knuckles, the blade twists. And when that blade twists, you're going to come off your line. You're going to see here, hopefully, I'm going to stay right on the line. Even if I don't, in this case, I have a little bit of wiggle room. But when I transfer to the pin lines, it's got to be pretty much right on the money. The other thing you want to do is set yourself up so that your elbow can swing freely. Okay, sort of, locomotive style, not locomotion. And that's basically it. It takes a lot of practice, just cutting straight lines. But once you cut about 100 lines a couple times, you start to get pretty good at it. And a good sharp saw helps too. So I'm going to go ahead and cut these lines. And you want to make sure you cut just to your baseline, but don't go past it. Otherwise, it's not going to look very nice in the end. Okay, so we've now cut those lines. This came out pretty good, I have to say. So the next step is waste removal. So we're going to remove this material here, which is where our pins are going to go eventually. Now to do this, again, there's multiple ways to do it. For this center piece here, I like to use a little coping saw. You can also just chisel them out, but it's basically waste removal. So however you need to get that out of there, you do it. So I'm going to cut out most of this with this coping saw, and then I'll come back and clean it up with a chisel. Okay. Piece removed. Now this is where we marked all 4 sides earlier with that marking gauge, and it gives us a little bit of a head start. And it kept all of our lines consistent because we're going to remove this end piece here. And to do that, I'm going to make a very clean cut with the handsaw. And I'm going to use this chisel and catch that line that I made with the marking gauge earlier. So I know that that is exactly where that cut needs to go. Tap this chisel. Remove this little sliver of wood. So closer look. Move that little sliver of wood, gives me a little trough to put my saw blade into and give me the best chance of making a very straight and accurate cut here. Okay. Same thing on the other side. Okay. So now I've removed the material. You can see we've got ourselves a pretty good looking tailboard. I need to go in here and clean this up with a chisel. I'm gonna do that quickly, and then we will move on to the pinboard. So I'm gonna move the camera down here a little bit. When you're chiseling through this stuff, it's important that you only go halfway through on each side. Otherwise, you will blow out the wood and really have a mess instead of a showy, clean joint. You see I did about halfway on that. I'll flip the board over and not removing too much material at once. Through. That up over there. That's looking pretty good. So I'm just going to clean up those baselines quickly, and then we're going to lay this out for the pinboard. So I talked about sharpening in an earlier video, and this is a good time to remind everybody, or for the first time, sharp tools are safer than dull tools. So you can see here that I am coming in here pretty close to my hands, and should this tool slip, I could have a pretty serious cut. But the fact that the tool is sharp makes it less likely to slip. I have to use less force to use it. And counterintuitively, the sharper tool is actually safer. So just a good reminder. And if you haven't seen the sharpening video, it will be up later on. And sharpening is something that everyone should learn early on. It definitely makes for a more enjoyable experience in the shop, and it just makes everything safer too. So, okay. So you can see I sort of just cleaned up the schmutz in between those different tails, and now we have a very clean looking tailboard.
Hey, Adam.
Yes.
We've got a question here. Helen wants to know if there's an ideal or maximum thickness of the wood that you recommend for creating dovetail joints.
Sure. I mean, there's no real limitation. I think about the smallest I would want to use is maybe like a 1/4 inch, and that would be pretty tough. I'm working with stuff that's about a 1/2 inch today, which is pretty common for drawers, interior drawers and that kind of thing. But I think anywhere from like a 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch is a good place to start. And the slightly thinner stuff will be easier for you than trying to do like big, massive, 1.5 inch thick or something like that. So.
Awesome. Thanks.
Yeah, cool. Thanks for your question. Okay, so in order for these joints to work, we need to mark them out so that they match up perfectly on top of one another. And to do that, I'm gonna put the pin board in the vise and lay the tail board on top of it to line them up and mark out where the joints go. So it works if you can get this guy pretty much flush with your tabletop, and it works to your advantage. And all I'm going to do is lay this on top here. And then I'm going to use a marking knife. So this is one of those times where a really sharp pencil is accurate, but a sharp marking knife is going to give you far better results. So you want to get this on here nice and tight and just sort of clamp it down with your other hand and mark these lines. When you're using a marking knife, what I've learned from other people in my own experience is several very light passes with that marking knife are going to give you better results than really trying to jam it into the wood and get a dark line, just because those wood fibers are going to try and pull your knife almost in the way that like a slushy road pulls your car tires. It's very difficult to keep the knife straight if you're going too hard and too fast, but a few light passes, like less pressure than you would use to you know, butter a slice of bread or something. It's just very, very light. So, all right, I've got those lines marked. Pretty faint. I think it might be hard to see on camera, but I will highlight them with the pencil. So that's what that looks like. And now all I need to do is add the vertical lines here, and then I will make some cuts. So here again, I'm going to use the dovetail marking gauge and a marking knife. And you can use the marking knife just to catch that previous mark that you made, and that gives you a perfect lineup. And then you're going to come straight down. And you're just going to follow all these lines, doing the same method. I'll highlight with a pencil. So at this point, your board's going to look a little bit like this. So I'm going to go ahead and mark this backside here just so I can see where I'm going when I cut, and then I'll make a few cuts and we will be just about there. So again, you want to be careful not to go past your baseline with any of your marking efforts, just because your eye and mind are going to follow those lines. And so just moving slowly and deliberately is always a good idea in the shop. I have to remind myself of that sometimes. And here we go. All right. So again, these lines are a little bit different. This is, again, a different shaped wedge, but I'm just going to follow the lines with the saw and using a light grip on the saw, just make my way through all those straight cuts, and then we'll come in and remove the waste in the middle. Now is also a good time to talk about which side of the line you cut on. This is literally like splitting hairs, and it can be a little bit difficult to understand, but if we understand here that all this stuff in the middle is waste that we're going to remove, when you put that saw blade down, you could be on this side of the line, you could be on this side of the line, or you could be right on it. I like to put the saw blade just inside the line on the waste side. Okay, the saw blade itself is going to remove material. And so if you're on the line itself, which you marked, you're pin opening is going to be just a little bit bigger than what you actually wanted. It may still be serviceable. You can fix almost any joint as long as it is strong enough. But to get the best results, it's better to cheat onto the waist side of the line. And that way, if when you go to fit the joint, you need just a little bit more space, you can get in there with a chisel or a file or something like that and make it fit. Whereas if you have too much space, you're going to be, trying to find little shims of wood to glue in there, and they just never look as good as a joint that's cut right on the money, straight from the saw blade. So I'm going to go ahead and do my best cutting here, just inside. You almost want to leave half of the line. So if you can split the hair perfectly, cool. If not, stay on the waist side. Okay, so we've made those straight lines. That gives us a guide to come in with the coping saw again. It's going to come in and go down and over, get most of that waste out, clean it up with the chisel. This is where a lot of ugly mistakes can happen. If you go below that baseline, you're going to have a gap there that you're going to need to fix or fill. So you want to leave a little bit of material above that baseline. So you can see there, you can still see the baseline. And you kind of got like a wavy line where I use the handsaw, but there's still some material there. So I'm just going to quickly take a chisel and clean that up. So you want to use the widest chisel, obviously. I give you the best shot at keeping your line straight. Again, only going about halfway through so I don't blow the wood out on the other side. Wood fibers are going to try and hold together on the other side of this, but by severing them on this side, when I come around and hit the wood with the chisel on the opposite side, those fibers are already broken, so it'll look nice and clean. And here again, I'm just using that line that I scored earlier so that my chisel has a way to, as a resting place. If you go to try this on your own, just know that I've cut literally thousands of these, which means I'm hopefully a lot faster than you. but also know that I still make small mistakes. So I already saw one spot here where chisel slipped a little bit and baseline's not going to be perfect. So once I've removed most of the waste, I'm just going to put it back in the vise here and come in and make sure that this bottom is nice and flat so that the joint will seat all the way. I could probably use a little bit more work, but don't want to bore everybody with just idle chiseling. So this is the moment of truth. We now have pin board and tail board, each cut pretty carefully, pretty well. And now I'm gonna see if they fit together. And I'm just gonna try and use light pressure. And I think we got a little bit lucky, and I've done this before, but they fit together pretty darn good. There you go. So you can see here there's a little bit of space between that baseline. I need to clear that out and flatten out the bottom a little bit more. That'd probably take another 2 or 3 minutes of slow chiseling, and I don't want to subject you all to that. So that's the basics of a dovetail joint. Cut tails first. So anybody have any questions on the process?
Yeah, we had one more question. What type of wood do you recommend beginners start with when trying to create dovetail joints?
Sure. I like to start people with pine or poplar. Clear white pine is, you can buy it really easily at Home Depot or Lowe's. It's inexpensive. It's ready to go. Poplar is also really nice. And I think you can get poplar in the 1/2 inch dimension ready to go at Home Depot. And it's inexpensive. And so if you make mistakes and you're just sort of chopping wood, it's a great way to start. So,
does this process work with plywood?
It would. It's just typically not used. So plywood, when you start making little cuts into plywood, those veneers start fraying out, and it just sort of looks kind of goofy. I've seen it done with machined dovetails, though.
Wow. Do we have any other questions? All right.
All right, and just as a side note, I used cherry today, which is one of my favorite woods to work with. It's very predictable, but poplar would be great to work with. Pine can be, you want to make sure your tools are very sharp with pine. Softer woods actually require sharper tools. So if you get started on those woods, I would just make sure your chisels are sharp. And if our video is not up and you need a quick tutorial, you can get my information through the Maker Hub here, and we'll get you situated. So
fantastic. Oh, sorry. One more question. Do you hand sand this stuff, or do you just use a chisel?
When I'm fitting the joints, I would use a chisel or a file, just because it's going to give you a flat reference point. If you're sanding, the tendency is, no matter how careful you are, the sandpaper, especially even if you use like sandpaper attached to like a flat stick or something, it's going to round things over and your joint's not going to look as good. It's not going to be as tight. So I would recommend using a chisel for the steps I showed you today. If you don't have access to chisels, then certainly a file would be the next best option. And then failing all that, yes, take a flat, thin piece of wood and glue the sandpaper to it, and then just try to be really careful to keep it straight and not let it kind of rock on the piece. Once it's all glued together, you're going to have some spots that you're going to want to like smooth out, and for that you could absolutely sand them out. I tend to use a hand plane to get started and then finish with sandpaper, just because the hand plane's faster. but that's not something everybody has on hand. So.
All right, I think that's all of our questions. Adam, thanks so much.
All right, well, thanks everybody for participating today. I hope you enjoyed it. That series has been a lot of fun. So the videos will be online soon. If you have any questions on anything we covered, please do get in touch with me through the Maker Hub. Once we're back, this is summer 2020 for anybody watching in the future, and we're all in lockdown mode. So once we're back in the Maker Hub, I'll have regular hours in there, and I'll be happy to go further with anybody, and we'll cover it. So again, my name's Adam Godet. I own and operate Godet Woodworking here in Washington, D.C. You can buy my stuff all over the city. Primarily, I have a line of retail goods in the Shop Made in DC stores. There's one in Georgetown. We're opening one in Capitol Hill soon, DuPont Circle and the Wharf, and various other places throughout the city. You can also check out my website, godetfurniture.com. And please do get in touch if you have any questions. And thanks a lot.